Two middle-aged guys try to work it all out. Two middle-aged guys try to work it all out. Two middle-aged guys try to work it all out.
Hey folks, welcome to Two Middle-Aged Guys Trying to Work It All Out. It's me, Dave, and with me, as always, is my co-host...
Chris.
Yeah, that's... Oh, so there's a pause there.
I was waiting for co-host and friend.
I'm sorry, yes. And you know what? Not only are you my co-host, you're my friend. How about that? And I am your co-host. It's a 50-50 split. I didn't want you to... It's not like my sidekick...
Right. I'm not the Andy to your Conan. I understand that.
Yes.
No. Or the Ed to your Johnny. That's not the kind of relationship we have.
But that would be great. If either of us were Ed or Johnny, I would totally take that. Today we're going to be talking about, we do occasionally talk about video games. We're not a retro gaming podcast or a gaming podcast broadly, but we do like to talk about video games. And today we're going to be talking about the Atari 2600 or the VCS. The old name was the VCS. But before we get into that, I'd like to play a little game with you to kind of test you on some Atari 2600. I don't want to say trivia, but minutia maybe. I'm going to name 5 Atari games, and I want you to tell me, are these real Atari 2600 games, or are they something I made up, or maybe a game for a different system that I've attributed to the Atari 2600.
Okay.
All right. First one, a game called Pressure Cooker.
I'm going to say you made that up.
That game is real, made by Activision, made by Gary Kitchen, who based it on, and I don't remember the gameplay on this one. I'm sorry, 1983. Based it on his experience working in a Burger King.
Very good.
Yeah. Next one. Frankenstein's Monster.
I'm going to say real.
That one is real. It is from 1983, and it's a what they called at the time, a platformer, but it's really more of a Donkey Kong style game. And 83 looks a little bit better than some of the older games, but still not great. Next game, Atari Warriors.
Not 2600. I know there was an arcade version and an NES port. Maybe one of the later Atari systems, but I'm going to say not 2600.
Atari Warriors is real from 1991. It was one of the last 4 North American games released.
Really? For the 2600?
Yes, it doesn't look great. It doesn't look
I
great.
can't imagine it does.
Next game, I Want My Mommy.
I'm going to say no, that's not real.
That game is real. From 1983. You play a teddy bear. It's it looks also like a Donkey Kong style game. I never played it. But you play a teddy bear. And on the front, the cartridge, there is a teddy bear. It looks like he's crying because he wants his mommy.
That's so sad.
It's for little kids, yeah.
Yeah.
Last game, Manja.
I'm going to say that's real.
Manja, which is Italian for something related to food, is real.
Okay, good.
All of them are real. 1983, it is a game where you have to eat as fast as you can. Someone is bringing you food. And I think that this is, it's real. And if you don't keep up or something like that, your stomach explodes. So I think that the guy from Seven, the killer from Seven, it's a David Fincher game. Very weird, deeply weird game. All those are real, which goes to show you that the breadth of the Atari 2600's library was huge. Yes. They were making games from the 70s to the 90s. 91. I mean, that's getting toward, it was when Atari Warriors came out. That's getting towards the end of the NES's life.
That blows me away. Yeah, that's almost the beginning of the Super Nintendo.
It's getting close, right? So That's how long that system had a degree of viability for. A degree. Today, I think, like I always we like to frame up our topics as questions, things we figure out. That's why we call the show two middle-aged guys trying to work it all out. The question I think that we have is the Atari 600 the most important home video game system ever, right? Does it, where does it fit in level of importance? What is its impact? Chris, let's figure it out today.
All right, let's figure it out.
Or work it out.
Ooh, even better.
To give our listeners some context, I love Atari, right? I love, and particularly the 2600. There's not a lot to love outside of that, I think, to be honest. But I've got several books on Atari on my bookshelf, and I've read many others that I don't own. You'd be surprised how many books have been written about Atari and broadly the history of video games. I thought we'd put a little perspective where Atari sets in the generations of home video game systems. So there's this concept of generations. I think we're on the 7th or 8th generation right now, depending upon, there's different ways to count them. So I'm using a pretty standard one that Wikipedia calls the Wikipedia model for generations.
That's fair.
Right? And it was the one that was the most rational when I looked at the other models. Like, this one actually makes sense. Some of these other models are kind of stupid. But anyway, so there's, I'll give a context, right? So Gen 1, this is about home video game systems, not about arcades. So Generation 1, what fit into that was the Odyssey, which was a very weak system, and then the Pong systems, which were these like almost like those plug and play TV games, right? That's kind of what a Pong was. You couldn't put cartridge in it. It wasn't expandable. It usually had controllers like built into the console, but it did one thing, which is play Pong. You hooked up to your TV, you played Pong. No cartridges, no swapping out, and that made up basically Generation 1 in most people's view. And then Generation 2 is when you got the Atari 2600, the Intellivision, the ColecoVision, and then the Atari 5200, which is, extremely low-powered, microprocessor-based, 8-bit based, replaceable, swappable cartridge-based systems. And then for context, Gen 3 was the Nintendo Entertainment System, the NES, the Sega Master System, and the Atari 7800 make up what is broadly considered Gen 3. Some people put the TurboGrafx into that category, some don't. I think it's the start of Gen 4, personally, but or the PC Engine, for those that know it by that name. So Gen 2, and we already talked about the Atari, lived well beyond its humble beginnings in the late 70s. So I thought, for context, I thought maybe that would be something we could talk about. In the landscape of home gaming systems, right? We talked about, in the late 70s, you had the Odyssey, which did have swappable cartridges. You had the Pong systems, and that was kind of it. There was the Fairchild Channel F, which is considered a Gen 1 by some, a Gen 2 by others, and that came out, but that was a failure as well.
Did Fairchild ever come to the States? Or was that Japanese only?
I thought it came to the States in extremely limited numbers.
Maybe. I'm not sure.
Because we were, we think about now, gaming as being, Japanese companies, right? Sony, Nintendo, and then Microsoft, which is sort of still the American company that's doing it. But really, at the time in the 70s, gaming was an American.
You know what? You're right. I have confused them. I was thinking of the FM Towns. I was not thinking of the Fairchild. So
that comes much later.
Yes, I was confused. My apologies.
No, but the landscape at that time, the Odyssey did have swappable cartridges, but, the Magnavox Odyssey, or is it Mattel Odyssey? Which one?
It's Magnavox.
Magnavox, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
And I've only seen one or two of these, like in game stores that were almost like museum pieces. They're so old. It had could support 3 dots on the screen. And it had overlays, like these plastic cling things you put on the screen. There was no real concept of graphics. You were moving a box on the screen. But they called a dot, which was a box. It was so big, right?
Yeah, and it was more, almost approached more of like a digital board game as opposed to a video game.
Yeah.
Especially with the overlays, that did a lot. That's what changed your game. Sure, you would put a different cartridge in, but it would look virtually identical, and if you did not have the screen overlay to tell you where that dot was moving, you couldn't play it. It was useless.
Yes, and so that was the state of the home gaming system. You had obviously more powerful, better stuff in the arcades, but significantly, very, very expensive an outlay, for those machines. And then, the Atari 2600 came out, and it really did bring the power, or at least a snippet of that power of the arcade home for the first time.
Yeah.
Right. And it, the swappable cartridges, which meant you bought your main base, your console, and then, you could keep buying software from the company. So it became, a way for companies to, keep selling things and make money. It wasn't like those very limited systems like the Odyssey, where they had just a handful of games, or the, plug and plays like the Pong machines, where they couldn't sell software for it. It became not only a great piece of hardware, but it became its own kind of like economic model of hardware and software in a way that consumers hadn't really dealt with before, because home computers they hadn't, permeated society yet, and wouldn't for another, several years until Mac and PC really started to become more affordable. A couple $100 for an Atari, that was, still big money in the late 70s, but attainable by working class people like you and I.
Right. And there was a plug and play element too. I mean, like if you put somebody at that stage in front of a computer, that required some real technical know-how to get it to work. Whereas an Atari, you plug A into slot B and you're off and going.
You're right. I mean, that cannot be discounted, right? There was no configuration, there was no setup. You had to hook it up to the twin wire leads to the antenna on your TV, and you were rocking and rolling. So it was a revolution, really, not just in terms of like home entertainment, but in bringing digital technology into the culture and into the being attainable to everyday people, which was something that probably doesn't get focused on or understood enough, of just how big of a deal that part of it was, right? And it opened the door for people to think, I could maybe have a computer in my home. I thought it would be important for those that are maybe less familiar with the Atari, maybe some of our younger listening audience, like in the 30s, those that are not older like us, that maybe weren't as familiar, right? That's the context of when this came out. I think it helps us answer that question. And the Atari was released in, I believe, 77, right? 77 or 79. So that's right about the time we were born. I should have looked that up. I can't believe I did not look that up. I'm pretty sure it's 77. It is 77. Yeah. I know that. I can remember that because the Retron 77 was named that, a modern retro console. So that was a year before I was born and a couple years before you were born. So even us, as old and ancient as we are not as old as the Atari 2600.
Yeah, so it was 77 in North America, but I find this fascinating because it was released in Japan in 1983.
That is crazy.
I know, isn't that crazy? Not terribly successful, but fascinating piece of
By that time, you had the Sega SG-1, I believe, coming out. And the Famicom, I think, would come out either that year or the next year. So it had no chance.
Right there, yeah.
That's crazy. And now, the disparities in Windows are not that big, and it's with Sony and with Nintendo, it can often be the other way around.
Right.
Or day and date, right? It can be the exact same. So that's context, right? Well, let's talk about personal experiences. How did you play Atari for the first time? How did you get your Atari 2600 for the first time?
Yeah, this is going to be disappointing, but I don't remember.
Oh!
In my brain, it was just always there. It was always in my bedroom, hooked up to a tiny little bitty, probably 8-inch TV.
Wow, was it color?
I don't think so. But again, we're in fuzzy territory for me right now. So I get
widescreen, or was it 4x3?
It was 4x3. This was. Ooh. They didn't. Yeah, widescreen didn't exist back then.
It didn't? Oh, okay. I don't remember a time before widescreen.
Okay, well, you're lucky. No, but anyway, I don't. My parents had to have bought it, and they had to have set it up for me. I don't remember though. I know my cousin, who I idolized. I know that he had one, so I don't know if I played his first, and then that's what clued me in on it, or if my parents were like, this is just something that Chris will enjoy, so let's get this for him. I don't know. But I do remember having one. I remember having a stack of games that fit into like one of those like tiny little shelves like cassette tapes used to fit into, that you'd slot the cartridges in so I could
Yeah.
see them all, the spines of all of them lined up, and I could dutifully choose what game I was going to play and what order. And so that was a lot of fun. But how I was introduced to it, I cannot tell you.
Wow. Maybe it came with the house.
It could have.
It was just there one day. I remember mine. I got mine Christmas morning on 1990 in 1990, which is 7 years after Japan. And I listen. It wasn't a Nintendo. Everybody else had a Nintendo, but I was perfectly happy to have gotten that. I had never played one up until that moment. I knew they existed because of everybody knew Atari existed, and also from the Sears and Montgomery Ward catalogs. I didn't circle the Atari 2600. I actually think I might have circled the Atari 7800. Oh, yeah. So thank goodness I didn't get what I wanted. 7800 could play 2600 games, so that's something. But yeah, I got mine, and I was like, okay, not a Nintendo. It's got one less button. That was kind of the way I looked at it at the time. That's one less button. But the cool thing about it is in 1990, when you got it, Atari cartridges were dirt cheap. New, they were $10, maybe 20.
I'm surprised they were that high.
Well, like Mario Brothers, which came out later in the life, right? Talking about the original one, the sewer game with 2-player Mario and Luigi at the same time. Some of the later releases like Commando, Ikari Warriors. But that was new, right? You could find them for $1 a piece at flea markets, Goodwill, garage sales easily, right? Somebody got their Nintendo and they wanted to get rid of all their Atari games, and $1.50. So I loaded up very rapidly. I had like 70 cartridges, 60. I mean, it was a lot, right? So, yeah, I mean, so it was really easy getting it that late to build your collection.
Yeah.
And I played the heck out of it, and I also got a lot of accessories, different types of controllers and joysticks. I got a trackball. I paid like $6 for a trackball to play Centipede with, which was cool. I mean, it made the game more fun. And of course, they had many different paddles. I had these really cool Gemini. The Gemini system was an Atari clone, because there was clones all over the place of Atari systems. And the Gemini had a really neat controller style that was similar to the 7800 controller, and it also had not a trackball, but the paddles built in. And it was a lot of fun. It was great, and so you didn't have to. You had two wires to it. You had to kind of like switch. I don't remember how the switching out and how that worked. It was pretty janky, but it worked great. And I had so much Atari stuff because it was cheap. I mean, people were just kind of giving it away to avoid throwing it away, right?
Yeah.
In 1990, so.
It was very much a flash in the pan. I mean, it lasted for several years, but it burned really hot, and then it suddenly became nothing. Nobody wanted it, nobody supported it.
Yeah.
Very just rapidly and very strange. And almost took the entire industry down with it.
Yes.
But
I do want to get into that, and the game that is oft that's hung onto in just a minute. I'd like to talk about the good games.
Sure.
Before we get to that, but because it did. It's the Atari crash. That was a big deal in the industry, and for many years the Atari went sort of undisputed in that segment, right? The Coleco and the Intellivision did come out, but they were not big competitors, right? I mean, the Intellivision had some really neat looking games. And they had their unique visual style. Pretty hideous controller, was not a big seller, though. I mean, I think Atari 2600 dwarfed it by probably 10-1 in terms of units sold. The ColecoVision had some really great games, a lot of the same games that were for the Atari, but they looked better. Because it had, it had close to 5200 level, Atari 5200 level processing, maybe even on parity with it in memory. But the 2600 still beat them all for some reason, right? Install base, cheaper, right? The consoles kept getting cheaper. And it was Atari.
Yeah, a lot of it was also, it was first to market. I mean,
Yes. It built that base.
it built that base, and I mean, technically it wasn't first to market because you had Generation 1 out initially.
I don't know if that really counts.
Yeah, that's fair. But, it landed, it was hugely successful, and so it became synonymous with video games. So even as a kid who was into video games, like I'd never seen a ColecoVision. Like that was not on my radar until I was much older and then was interested in the history of video games. But at the time, I didn't know what that was. It was Atari and then nothing. There was nothing else that was on that level or even could compete until the NES came out.
And I bet if you were playing ColecoVision, to your parents, you were still playing Atari.
Oh,
because
yeah.
It became synonymous,
Yeah,
Xeroxing something, it became synonymous with copying something.
Yeah.
And at the time, right, I think it was kind of maybe an install-based thing, right? Because people had not become numb and desensitized to spending money like that, like we are now. So they were not ready to, after 4 or 5 years, upgrade to an Intellivision or a ColecoVision. Like, I'll stick with the one we got, especially since they're still making games for it, which they were and did for a long time. But yeah, I had so many memorable games on my list here. The first game I ever got when I got my Atari, it did not come with a game, but I got a game with it at Christmas, was Galaxian, which is, in that Space Invaders. It's an upgrade of Space Invaders, but it's not as good as Galaga, right? But it was still a lot of fun. And I still remember the noise that it made, the very simple, the rich sound of Galaxian.
Yes.
Did you have that game?
I did have that game, and
everybody had that game,
right? Of course, but my interesting story with that game is because that was my first exposure to that style of game. For years, I thought Galaxian was the king, and what is this Galaga thing? They ripped off Galaxian, man. Are you kidding me? So, it was that weird kind of not knowing the true situation, and just because of my experience, I was like, oh, Galaxian is where it's at.
That's the top of the heap right there. Not going to get any better than Galaxian. It was made by Taito, right? Didn't Taito make that? Or was it Midway, maybe?
I don't remember.
Galaxian and Space Invaders and Galaga were all made by the same company. I thought that was Taito.
I'd have to look it up. I don't remember off the top of my head.
And they were kind of like a succession, right? A series of upgrades. And Galaxian, it is a good game. Galaga is the king of those type of games. It is truly at the top of the heap. But I loved that. That was the first game I had. I've got several here. You throw out a memorable game.
I've got several here as well, but the one I'm going to start with is one that I believe was a pack-in title, or it was one of those that was completely synonymous with everybody who had one, and that was Combat.
Yeah, it was a pack-in. It was like the first pack-in ever, right? I guess.
Yeah. So I had Combat, and I loved Combat, and they were all fun. But the one that really mattered to me was the tanks, where you would shoot the missile back and forth. And later, it was remade as Scorched Earth, and that's kind of what everybody knows it as now is Scorched Earth game. But Combat, I played for hours and hours and hours at a time as a kid. Just always moving that tank cannon just up and down by degrees, and then firing and hoping that you'd get the guy. And for such a simple game, even to this day, I absolutely adore that one version of Combat. But that I do want to take a moment to share a really weird thing, even to this day, that the Atari has that I don't know of any other system that did this. But Combat was one cartridge that came with 4 different games.
Yes.
And the way that you would switch through the games is you'd plug in the cartridge, and then there were what is essentially dip switches.
Dip switches, yeah.
On the Atari.
6 in the original version, then you go to... I guess there was always the same number of switches, right? They just kind of consolidated them or put different modes, because there was 4 switches in later versions, but I don't know how that exactly worked.
Did it start at 6? I thought it started at 4 and then dropped to 2. Maybe I'm wrong.
I thought it started at 6, went to 4, and then by the time they got to the Junior, which is the tiny one, which is the one I had, right? That I don't know. I don't know how many it had.
All right. Well,
They weren't switches in the same way anymore. They were these
right.
weird black
Right.
slider type. I don't know.
Yeah, but they had these dip switches on the console, and how you adjusted them would define what game was loaded off of the cartridge. And Combat used that to cycle through different games. Other cartridges used it to manipulate the game that you had. So maybe like certain dip switch combinations would make the game more difficult or would make the game easier or something like that. But a really weird, kind of product of its time of how are we going to manage altering this program in a fundamental way, in a way that the users can affect it. And that was their solution. So
they didn't have menuing systems, right? They didn't have the memory for that,
right.
memory on the chip, memory on the system. Nothing fancy, right? The dip switches were how you set modes, right?
Right.
Do you want to play combat with tanks or do you want to play combat with airplanes, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
exactly.
It's kind of how it was.
Exactly. And then later, when you started buying those games at flea markets that did not come with manuals or boxes,
you just kind of messed around.
Yeah. And I remember having games that I would flip the switches and be like, I cannot tell the difference. Like, I don't know if this is actually doing anything.
This is a lighter shade of green on a different shade of yellow, but otherwise it looks the same, right? This hideously ugly game looks basically the same. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. And it was something, at the time it was probably a huge deal, right? But it was a technical necessity, right? They had to do that in order to have multiple modes, because menus weren't that there was no memory for that. You write the menu, there'd be no room for the game. I mean, some of those games were 4K, 2K, 4K. Now open a Word doc, type a sentence in, and it's going to be 10K, right? So that's how tight and tiny the machine code was for those for that little 8-bit processor. 6502 maybe, I can't remember. 6502 might be the NES probably. Anyways, it was all assembler machine code, highly complex, because you had to squeeze performance out of that. They call it chasing the beam. I don't know if you've ever heard that term. But for our listeners, right, that meant that the processor was just fast enough to write the images on the screen. So it had to, there was no lag. Lag would have meant nothing would have been on the screen. So it had to be very efficient in order to keep stuff on the screen, right? It was only that fast, not a bit faster, and it could not perform any slower. So that's chasing the beam. The beam refers to old CRT TVs that used a beam.
Yeah, and with that little piece of trivia, we're going to get to some games on our lists that are technical marvels.
There are some
that they were able to accomplish that with that hardware. But until then, it's your turn. What is your next game?
Well, I'm going to mention Superman. Superman for the Atari was a great, fun game. It was almost like an open world game before an open world game, which wasn't that big of a world. It was like a 9-12 screen world on a grid. But it was fun. You flew around. You had to rescue Lois Lane or something. You found criminals and you flew them around and you picked them up and then I don't know. But it was fun. You got to fly around as Superman. It was more fun than the NES's Superman game, which was a pretty terrible game.
Yeah.
But I loved that game. I just fly around as Supes. It was fun.
I don't think I had that one as a kid.
I
knew it existed.
Really?
But I don't remember having a copy myself. So
that cartridge art is also iconic, right? Superman standing there. I think
it's nice.
It's just a cool looking cartridge. Never had Spider-Man though. I never had Spider-Man.
No, I
always wanted it.
Atari either.
Yeah, that's what's hard to find. I think there was a Parker Brothers game, and that was hard to find.
All right. Well, the next one I'm going to call out is a game you may know called Kaboom.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Do you know Kaboom?
I do know Kaboom.
Yeah.
Paddle game,
So Kaboom
right?
was a paddle game, and there was a criminal on the top of a bank, and he was throwing bombs down to try to break into the bank, and then you had to use your paddle.
Yes.
Of course. That was the very popular way to break into banks in the late 70s.
Blew up a lot of money.
But you used your paddle in kind of a breakout style way, but instead of bouncing the ball back, you would just collect these bombs to make sure that they didn't hit the bank and explode the bank or whatever. And the thing that's crazy to me about Kaboom is this game was ridiculously hard. It moved so fast that it's still hard to believe how fast it moved to this day. And this game was super fun, but only for about 3 to 4 minutes. And then it became impossibly hard. Nobody could ever keep up with this thing. And so because of that, it was only fun in really short spurts. But, you know, boy, if you got in the mood to play Kaboom, you were going to be rocking it for a couple of minutes there.
Only fun for 3 to 4 minutes. You described most of the Atari library. I don't mean to speak ill of it, but Kaboom was a very good-looking game, as were pretty much everything in the Activision catalog was great-looking. They managed to squeeze performance out of the system that, you know, just things out of the system that were not other developers were not able to do. So that was Kaboom is a absolute classic and a paddle game. And I'm just going to mention this. I loved paddle games.
Me too. Yeah.
Pretty much any paddle game I have very fond memories of. I'm going to call out Breakout and Super Breakout. They were, I would say they were the Tetris of their day, right? They were the game that everybody could play, including your mom. And they would enjoy. There was something, you know, fun and puzzly about it. There was some, you know, figuring the right angles to hit the ball. Super Breakout added a little bit better mechanics around that. Such a fun game, and I think that I don't know. I think that that those paddle games still kind of sort of hold up in a way. You know, better than maybe the joystick games do.
You know, it's a strong argument to be made that they've never made a better controller for that type of game than the paddle.
No,
I
agree.
Incredibly responsive. You know, and even though there were other versions of Breakout and Super Breakout that were closer to the arcade, you know, they looked prettier, they were more technically proficient. I don't know that they were as good because of that paddle controller.
Yep. You play Arkanoid on the NES, which is very similar, and but you know the D-pad just doesn't do it like the paddle does. So yeah, and you know any paddle game, right? You know Warlords, Pong, even. I just thought they're great games.
Next one I've got I'm going to call out is Joust, which is a game. Everybody knows this game.
Everybody.
You know, you're riding an ostrich, jousting, because that's historically accurate. But I've always loved Joust. Even as a little kid, going to the arcade and playing this game, you know, it was just weird and interesting and fun, and the physics are incredible. And so then when I saw, I could have that at home, I was thrilled. And I played so much Joust. And, you know, it's one of those things, the beauty of youth is you don't understand where things are not holding up as well as maybe they could, you know, because to me, playing Joust at home, it was no different than putting a quarter in at the arcade. You know, I was having just as much fun. Now I look back on it now and I'm like, oof, that's rough. Yeah. But at the time, I was just thrilled to be playing Joust.
I thought you were going to say, you know, ostrich abuse doesn't hold up as well. I thought you were going to make maybe a big an animal rights statement.
Is it abuse though? I mean, they seem to be well trained. They seem like they're happy.
I don't know. Don't they disappear once you hit them, or is that the rider that disappears?
Oh well, sure, but that's the bad guy.
Okay, all right. Well, then that's fine. It's the bad guy, the bad ostrich. Yeah, no, I've never been a big Joust fan at all. And I think I could chalk that up to just being absolutely terrible at it, like I am most games, but I'm particularly bad at Joust. But it does look really rudimentary compared to the arcade, which is which is itself not super advanced either. But
yes.
I'm going to mention this next one. It needs to be mentioned. Everybody's going to say, when are they going to say Pitfall, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying Pitfall just because it's Pitfall, and it is an iconic top 5 Atari 2600 game. But because I got it, and I got it in a haul of games that were purchased at a garage sale from my cousin who had a garage sale, and we bought them. And we had like 25, 30 games. That's where I got like a huge number like of my system collection, of my game collection. And I remember at the time thinking, wait, I didn't know you had an Atari. You've had an Atari for years. I've been coming over here, and you've never played it? Let me I didn't think that. Actually, I only thought about that as an adult. I was just happy to have Pitfall. That's such a fun game, and it really is an advanced game, right? As a platform, a true platformer. It did have the screen-to-screen type transition as opposed to, the horizontal scrolling, which didn't really exist on maybe a handful of Atari games. Jungle Hunt is the only one I can think of that actually had true scrolling like that.
I'm not even sure it did, but
did it not? Maybe
I take your point.
Yeah,
I think it was just very smart in the way it transitioned.
Okay.
But anyway,
but man, Pitfall was fun. I guess there was a way to beat it by finishing getting all the treasure in time and not losing any life or something. But I was never particularly great at it. I mean, I could play for a while without dying, but man, that felt like you were playing a real video game when you were playing Pitfall. Everybody else was playing Mario 2 at the time, and I was playing Pitfall. It's pretty awesome.
And you were having a good time with it. Yeah,
I was. I loved that game. That's one I can play for a little bit now. But yeah, still, it's a great game. It's technically super advanced for what it was doing, and I think it's an 8K game. Maybe I have to go and look at the size, but I mean there was a lot more code in that. And I believe they used bank switching in order to, because there's such little RAM in that the Atari. But I loved that game.
I think it is genuinely the best game on the Atari 2600.
Probably.
I think it's the most progressive game, and it really kind of plays like something that could have been on the NES. Graphically, it's not up to that level, but I think gameplay-wise, you could make that argument. And I agree when you said it feels like you're playing a real video game. To me, it's the only it's the only game on the Atari's library that does feel like a real video game to me. Like everything else, it does not age well in my eyes. And there is the only thing out of the entire Atari library that I will go back today and play. It is Pitfall.
So I will say I think Jungle Hunt falls into that category for me because it had concepts of bosses, and it was based on I believe a game called Jungle Adventure, which was a arcade game. So Jungle Hunt is kind of sort of similar to Pitfall, and you're in a jungle and there's vine swinging, and you're a little guy. You run right to left, which drives me nuts in that game. I've never understood that design decision. It does have bosses. It has an objective, which is to save the princess who's being held by the natives. Very culturally sensitive stuff, obviously. But it was I don't know. I might give it to Jungle Hunt as well. And obviously there's Pitfall 2, which is a bigger version of Pitfall, and it also had, not in addition to going screen to screen horizontally, you went screen to screen vertically. So it did have some of those, and then I don't know if you're familiar with the game Hero, which was very similar to Pitfall 2 in a lot of ways, and its design allowed you to kind of fly around. So I don't know. I think there's a handful, right, that feel like playing video games in that more modern sense, but not a ton.
Well, you did an excellent job of nailing all the ones that are contenders, right? like you got all of them there. But for my money, I'm going to give it to Pitfall. I think
I think it's the best of that. Yeah. I do have a very soft spot for Jungle Hunt though. And it does look good. Jungle Hunt looks pretty good
So Jungle Hunt is actually the next game on my list.
Oh, okay. All right. Sorry.
It was one that I'm calling out. No, that's okay. And the reason I'm calling it out because, and again, this is kind of like Joust, where if I look back at it now, I'm like, well, I was a dumb kid. What was I thinking? At the time, I remember thinking, finally, this is a game that I am not compromising by playing at home instead of playing at the arcade. And if you look at the arcade version versus the 2600 version now, they're worlds apart. But at the time, I was like, oh, this is arcade perfect. And I had a blast playing that game. And, it's a bit more level based than Pitfall is. I mean, Pitfall tries to build you this whole, like, you have this world that you're traveling in, whereas Jungle Hunt, it's like, well, once you finish swinging the vine, now you swim with the crocodiles, and then once you finish swimming with the crocodiles, it's more stage, kind of Mario Brothers esque like that. But man, I just as a kid, I was like, "This is it. We've arrived. This is arcade at home."
Yes, and it did kind of deserves that, right? I mean, it was closer than most things. I'll
Yes.
say that. One more, I think I'll mention. I have a few more on my list, but I'll mention one more. The Atari 2600 version of Missile Command is a really fun game. Now, it's one of the older ones. It's one of the uglier ones. It's certainly one of the more simple ones. But it had an addictive play style that, it still kind of holds up, right? It's a fun game. I like Missile Command in the arcade a lot. It's a fun game to play. And Atari's it does a good job of doing that with a joystick, which is saying something, right? Because the trackball to joystick is a very difficult transition to make. And other games like Centipede do not do a great job of that.
Right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I like Missile Command on Atari. Played tons of it as a kid, and I think it was a really good arcade to 2600 translation. All right, so the last one I'll mention is kind of the polar opposite of Jungle Hunt, where with Jungle Hunt I was like, we've arrived at arcade perfection. This one was so far from the arcade that it tore me up inside, and that is Lunar Lander.
Oh, that's a terrible game.
The arcade of Lunar Lander, I love.
I love
this
it.
day.
Yes.
I will lose hours to Lunar Lander.
Yep, because you're trying to get it right, getting your tilt right.
Exactly.
And
it's so much fun, and the physics are so good on it, and the Atari 2600 port is just absolutely hideous. There is nothing good about that game.
Yeah, I don't think that there's any way you could do that game justice on the hardware, even with modern programming techniques. That hardware just was not going to do that. But that is such a fun game, and part of what makes it so great though on the arcade is also the vector screen, right? Yes. So crisp. I love vector screens. They look so good, right? And
have you played it on the Atari 50 compilation?
I have not.
Not a vector screen, but outstanding.
Obviously, you don't. Yeah. You own a. Yeah, I'm just joking. But yeah, I mean, I would imagine like 4K, right? You could get it to look pretty darn sharp.
Yeah.
I will have to check that out.
It's really good. That whole compilation is stellar.
Yeah, it gets. Oh yeah, I only hear great things about that, and I might have to get that for my Switch.
There you go.
I'm going to mention just real quick some games that I had that are a little bit rarer, harder to find. A couple of them. I had Double Dragon for the Atari, and I'm trying to remember like how did you jump? Because I don't remember because it's one of those games. It's not pure side scroll. You can move vertically and horizontally. So how did you jump? I mean, did you hold down the button and hit up? I can't remember. But yeah, Double Dragon. Whew. And I had Commando, which was one of the later games. That was actually a pretty fun game.
Was that the same as the NES Commando? I mean, like the same game, but obviously on a different platform.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a very dumbed down version of that game, which was based on an arcade game, which was similar to Akari Warriors. Which I did not have. I believe Commando and Akari Warriors were both made by SNK, or maybe they were clones of each competitors with each other. Maybe Commando was. I don't know. I don't know. I did not. I made a note that I had Akari Warriors, and then I realized I didn't have Akari Warriors. That's a really tough game to get. I think I just had Commando and it did some wishful thinking I had Akari Warriors. I also had Empire Strikes Back. It was the only Star Wars game I had. I think it was the most common of all those. There was a Jedi Arena or something like that game with lightsabers, and I did not have that. I think there was a few others, but I did have Empire. It was very easy to find Empire Strikes Back with faded labels at flea markets for $1 in the early 90s, so I definitely had that and enjoyed it. You were a snow speeder pilot.
Yeah, I had Empire as well. And I had Jedi Arena.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, it was weird. Even by 2600 standards, it was weird because you didn't make contact with lightsabers. You pushing the button would cause the lightsaber to shoot a beam across the arena. So it was like a laser game instead of
As
a lightsaber game.
lightsabers do.
Of course.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. So that was weird. And then I tried to remember and look this up for this podcast, but I failed. But I had another game that was Millennium Falcon based.
Oh.
Oh, actually, now that I'm telling the story, I wonder if it was Return of the Jedi.
I was thinking Return of the Jedi, you were in the Falcon.
That may have been,
never owned that.
That may have been what I was thinking of. But, I mean, I'm absolute Star Wars nut as a kid. I had all of the Star Wars games on 2600, but I think Empire is the strongest one. It's pretty good in the idea that you're, fighting the AT-ATs and it's fun for a 2600 kind of game.
Yeah, it is, right? For a 2600 game. Yeah. Did you own any games that were like, you look back now and were like, okay, that was kind of rare or unusual?
Not that I recall. The only one on my list that I wondered was Jedi Arena. And I don't know if that was like super rare or if it was just, one that I happened to own. So I don't remember it in those kinds of terms. I only remember what I liked to play because like what was rare or hard to find, like I had no concept of that when I was this age. My entire world was what's on KB Toys shelf. Like that's all I know.
Or Circus World at the time.
Circus World.
Circus World
that's
was
true.
there.
Yeah. So I don't remember a lot of those. There's certainly some games I remember having that I never hear about. Like you can go to price charting and find anything, but like in the conversation of Atari, I never hear anyone talk about hide and seek, which was literally a game that in the manual they were like, tell the other player to shut their eyes while you hide, and it's like okay, which is charming and cute, but you never hear anyone like address that game. So I had some cartridges like that, but I don't remember having anything that I was like, oh, I scored a big one on this one, like that. That wasn't the way I thought.
Yeah, I didn't really. I mean, other than Double Dragon and Commando, which I got out of just luck. I think. I don't think I had anything that was rare. Was there any games that you always wanted but never got? I really wanted that game.
Yeah, and then here's a story. I always really wanted Masters of the Universe. I loved He-Man as a kid, and I actually got it one day. They had it at a Circus World or KB Toys, whichever one, and I was, oh my gosh, Mom and Dad, Masters of the Universe He-Man, I've got to have this game, and they bought it for me, and we got it home, and it did not work.
Oh!
And so we took it back, and we never found another copy. So I never got that. I have no idea how it plays to this day. So that one was gone.
I am pretty sure I've never seen that one in the wild at all. At the time or now, as looking at retro stores, the one that I had, the one that I always wanted but never got, and if you never played even, was Mousetrap. I don't know if you remember the game Mousetrap.
No, I don't.
I don't even remember anything about the gameplay at all. I just remember looking at the box and thinking that game looks cool. You were catching a mouse. And I do remember, like, the screenshot, there was a little piece of cheese somewhere on the screen that barely looked like a piece of cheese. But only out of the context did you realize that was a piece of cheese. But I always wanted that game. Never got it. It was always one of the $20 games. So I was, and I never saw it in a flea market. So never got the opportunity to get that one. But yeah. So we had touched on the Crash, right? So 77, it comes out. You get 5 or 6 years. You get some competitors in terms of Intellivision and Coleco, but still Atari's the top dog. Then there was a crash, right? The big video game crash of '83, and a lot of folks blame E.T. for that. And I don't know if that's fair. I mean, E.T. was a really bad game, and there were some bad financial decisions, just simply bad business decisions made around it. Like, I don't know, producing more cartridges than there were systems available, which doesn't make sense, right?
Yeah.
But that was the video game crash happened, and it pretty much just tanked the industry. I guess that computer games were still a thing and still somewhat viable, mostly viable. But in terms of home consoles, they thought that was it. All right, it's a fad. It's over. And the Atari did stick around. And I believe at the time Atari had been sold to Warner Brothers earlier, I think maybe in '80. And then I think in '83, around the time of the crash, the Tramiels owned it, which was the family that produced the Commodore 64, C64, and they were also mismanaging things in that world around that time. 83, 84 is when they took it over. So, it was it nearly killed Atari. In fact, it probably gave it the fatal blow. But they just didn't die for a while. They didn't know they were dead for another several years, another decade or so. And then, the industry was, harmed for, took a couple of years for it to really recover in the States.
Yeah, I don't think any other game could have sunk them other than E.T. And you're right, it didn't sink them because it's a terrible game, even though it is, but that's been adjudicated.
But there's
forever.
many other terrible games too.
Of course. And the fact that it's a terrible game is not any kind of a slight on the developer, because they did not have a fair shake in order to be able to even try to make a game that was functional, let alone good.
Right. They had 6 weeks to code it.
Something crazy. Yeah. But it's the business decisions that you alluded to is what sunk them, because they knew that this movie was hugely popular. They're like, we're going to make a fortune. Who cares if it's good? They're going to buy it. And it was that attitude more than any one particular game or experience that sunk the company. And I think you can look through the history of corporations and you can see a lot of examples like that. It's when it becomes a money grab for no other reason that typically things really start to go bad. And I think that's what you saw with Atari. It's humorous to me that they made more cartridges than systems that were out there, because I guess they thought this is such a big property that it's going to push systems on its own. I guess that was the thinking, or maybe somebody didn't understand simple math. Like, I don't know what was going on.
I don't know, because I'm not sure if they had enough systems in reserve, stock to sell to meet the number of copies of the game that they thought that they were going to sell. And then of course the infamous, which has been proven true, although the scope of which we still don't fully understand, but the dumping of the cartridges in a landfill and then going back and putting concrete on them, that might be apocryphal. There was a lot, and there was a lot of Atari hardware, I guess, dumped at that same landfill that they just didn't know what to do with. It was, it's not the worst game. I think that there are many other like Pac-Man clones that are actually worse. I wrote down Lock and Chase. I think it's just a terrible game. I owned that.
My problem with E.T. is not that the game is bad; it's that the game is fundamentally broken.
It is, and not fun. Even if it was broke or wasn't broke, it still wouldn't be fun.
If it wasn't broken, I could give it a pass. But my personal experience with E.T., because I had the game before I knew, the situation around it. But my personal experience with E.T. is playing it for hours and hours and hours, merely trying to figure out what the heck is going on. And I think I'm still a little bitter about that. I want those hours back. But when the hitbox to fall into the pit is so far outside of the pit,
sure,
that you just randomly fall, as for a 6-7-year-old, like, how do you process that? Like, it's like, what just happened? Why am I here? And I have some trauma there.
It's a bad game, and you're right. It is fundamentally broken, which goes back to the whole, not having enough time. The developer, whose name escapes me, but he did not have enough time. He left engineering and went on to be a therapist after that.
Yeah.
That developer did. I wish I could remember his name, but it's a real. It really did. It wounded it, and it took the Nintendo to bring it back in North America. Already a success as the Famicom in Japan, the Nintendo Entertainment System, revived the American interest in video games pretty much single-handedly.
Yeah.
So, how did you move on from Atari?
I moved on from Atari by getting an NES.
Yeah.
And that was such a death blow. Once I had a Nintendo, there was nothing I needed.
Didn't look back.
No, I never
did not look back.
And now there was a stepping stone I tried to take, because I had another cousin that had a Commodore 64.
Oh, okay.
And whenever, like the very few times we would go over to their house, I would see Commodore 64 graphics
They look
compared
good.
to 2600, and I was
Yep.
just like, I might as well be staring at a photograph. Like that's how I
Right.
perceived them. Like they're so good,
Photorealistic,
Yeah,
rich,
exactly.
and the orchestral music. I am getting lost in this. Is this real?
Yeah.
I'm losing my sense of self. I don't know what's my life and what's a game.
Yes,
That's how.
that's
Maybe
my
exaggerated a tad, but
nope.
yes.
That was my experience. And so of course, mom and dad, I got to have a Commodore 64. Never got one, which is fair. But then when the NES came out, that was it. That's all she wrote.
Yeah, and it's same, right? I think that this would be a story for many folks who had the 2600 up until the NES. The second they got the NES, they were done. Or Sega Master System, right? I mean, because that was equally
Sure.
as big of a jump. If you had the misfortune of getting a 7800, you know, maybe you're not you're still playing the 2600 games. That's all you got to choose from because there was like 30. But I guess it would be worth a mention to say the 2600 was followed up by the 5200, which was more along the lines of an Intellivision, ColecoVision level of power, but was not backwards compatible with the 2600. Very expensive, had the world's worst controllers that not only were really poor, but also broke too, right?
Yeah.
So you didn't have fun with them until it broke, and then you didn't get to do anything with them. And then that died, and the 2600 persisted, and then they released, Atari had the 7800, which they released late, and it came along around the same time as the Nintendo and the Sega Master System, and was just decimated. Not only did it not have the specs to match, it didn't have really very good games. The advantage is that it had backwards compatibility. That was its big selling point. But when you could buy, if you really wanted 2600, you could buy a junior at the time for, I think they were going for $30 retail, $29.95. So it was able to compete with the NES. Actually, that's how Nintendo did with the 2600. They just priced it so people like me, as a kid, poor, could afford it.
Yeah.
Did you think the 7800 had good games?
No.
Okay.
No.
I thought I may have detected something. The listener, you can't see Chris's face. I thought maybe you're like, oh, well, wait, I want to defend Ninja Golf, which is considered the best game on the system. It is absolutely unplayably terrible.
It's still awful.
Really?
No, the thought that I had that caused that facial expression was the 5800 actually had some 5200, sorry.
Yeah.
Actually had some crazy good arcade ports.
Right, they looked like arcade games, just
Yeah.
like the ColecoVision looked like arcade.
Yeah.
The 5200 did, but when your controller is not really capable of playing,
Right, which is unfortunate. But so I'll give the 5200 some credit there.
No, though it did have a nice look to it. But with the price, the reliability, the fact that it was the size of a small car, it was like a Yugo-sized machine, probably generated a lot of heat. You plug it in and like the house lights just kind of dimmer and flick.
But you save so much on your utility bill just by running your Atari. You turn off the heater.
Turn off the heat. Yeah, it just keeps the house nice and toasty. But yeah, so when Nintendo came out in North America, it just kind of shut down Atari. I mean, it just was, it just could not compete, and I never looked back.
Nope, me either.
Once I finally got one in like 91 or 92, whenever that finally happened. So, are you able to go back and play Atari games at all now? Atari 2600 games at all now?
I was not until Atari 50.
Okay.
And then the presentation, the fact that they took the time to make a lot of these games work with modern controllers, I found a lot of joy there. And it's, without giving too much away of the collection, it's almost packaged like a documentary, which is
Yes.
a weird thing to say for a video game, but just believe me and go with it. And so it's fascinating. And so that is the only situation where I've been able to go back and play them. Outside of that, like especially when emulation started becoming a thing and I started being interested in the history of video games, the only one which I've already mentioned was Pitfall. And I could go back and play that one, but that's it.
I try, I do. And if there were good modern paddle controllers, which they just have not done a good job of making those, except for maybe the Atari VCS, the computer system, the modern computer system, Atari's attempt to sort of kind of rebrand itself, one of their attempts. It did have a paddle controller built into one of their controllers. It looks pretty good, but the lack of a good paddle controller, particularly a good wireless paddle controller, makes it really tough for me to play those games. Well, obviously, right? And there are some wired ones you can get, but it's so hard with as our TVs gotten big, TVs have gotten bigger over time. Our space between us and the TVs has gotten bigger. Yeah. Harder and harder to do the whole wire juggling business. So yeah, so I try, but I really can't. I can't make it happen.
I will throw just one other piece into this conversation, which is, are you familiar with the Atari Game Station Go?
Yes, I am. The Game Station, which is, for our listeners, right, made by, that's made by, who's it made by?
Oh, it is not Atari. It's in conjunction with Atari.
Yes,
but
they also made the Game Station Deluxe, and now they're making the Game Station Pro or something like that, or...
Yeah, I'm on Google right now, but I'm not seeing who actually made it. So apologies for whoever actually made that hardware. But the reason I mention it is because it's the first Atari thing that I find compelling. And it's a handheld system, think about your Nintendo Switch, but it's got a joystick, it's got a paddle, and it's got a trackball all built in, just right there on the side. And that sounds pretty interesting. And if that could give me accurate control schemes for some of these old Atari games, I might enjoy that. So I'm keeping my eye on that little device.
Yeah, it's made by My Arcade, and they also have the Game Station Pro, which is the Go is the handheld, and the Pro is the Pro is the TV, the one you plug into the TVs. And but what I've heard about the Pro is that it's an emulation box, that's fine, that the wireless controllers are super finicky and cut out, which would not be a problem with the Go. I feel really silly saying Pro and Go. Thanks for making it rhyme. But I would say that that's a problem, right? The controller is a key part of that, right? And you have to make it awesome in order for it to appeal to people who are used to really great controllers, like the PS5 controller or the Xbox series, or even if they made it just as good as the Xbox 360 controller, right? They've got to make them really good. And when you have flaking out and not staying connected, which is kind of basic table stakes stuff, that's a problem. So and of course the at game stuff is just garbage, and I've even bought like the premium at game stuff that gets good reviews to try it, and it's just not good. It's hard to find Atari. I think that the 2600 plus, their new release that the Atari came out with. I hear good things about that, even though it is an emulation machine, but it plays cartridges. But I don't know if it's got a good wireless controller solution, which is pretty important. Maybe third parties have solved that. It's not a hard problem to solve. I do think though that as twitchy as those games are, you lag is a killer, right? It's a killer for video games, period. But the older you go back, the more lag becomes important. So I think Bluetooth would probably not be reasonable. You'd be looking at 2.4 gigahertz. Or 24 gig. What is it? 2.4, right?
2.4. Yeah.
I think you'd be looking at that in order to have a feasible wireless solution. But these are not like too difficult problems to solve. So, I have to look into that a little bit more. I would like to find a good way to play the paddle games because I think that those would be a lot of fun. But
yeah, and this may be that solution. I'm gonna wait until there's some reviews out and some people are talking about it because it's gonna be $150, which is not just like randomly grab it and go kind of money. But
sure.
if it nails everything it's trying to, I might be interested in that.
Well, I think we've, unless you have anything else, I think we've kind of come to the end of our full cycle Atari. And I think we got to come back to the question, is it the most important, most impactful video game system in the history of home video game systems?
I am prepared to answer. And my answer is no, it is not.
Yeah. I am also prepared to answer, and the answer is no, it is not. I got to give that to the NES because I think that the Atari seemed like a fad, a fluke, a flash in the pan. A little alliteration there. It's funny when you mispronounce alliteration. I think that may actually be irony. That's not even Alanis Morissette irony. That's
it's real irony.
But whereas Nintendo made it so that this is a real viable business and entertainment form. So I got to give it to the NES.
I do too. And if the question was a little bit different, if is Atari the most important company in video game history, I think you'd have a little bit more discussion there.
I still think it goes to Nintendo, but I do think it's yeah, I don't know. I still think
so. Okay, so here's my thought process, right? So without the Atari 2600, I believe that you still eventually get the NES. Without Atari, I'm not sure that you would eventually get Donkey Kong. And so then I don't know if Nintendo would have been put on the path that they have walked without Atari, full stop.
That's interesting. But without Nintendo, you would have also never gotten Donkey Kong. So that's one of those sort of chicken egg type questions that we will philosophically probably never be able to answer. But it's an interesting thought experiment. But yeah, I'm going to stick with Nintendo. Not that I do think that the 2600 is probably the second most important system, and I think Atari is probably the second most important company in the history of video games. I think you could maybe make an argument that the PS3 might be maybe just as important, certainly to modern gaming.
I would have said PS2.
Oh, okay. Yeah, boy. Yeah. You know what? I think we may have teed up a future episode, folks. But we know we answered this. It's not the 2600.
It's not the 2600, no. And if you want to follow us and find out when that future episode lands, feel free to do that at 2middleagedguys.com. That is 2, the numeral 2, middleagedguys.com. From there, you can get all of our episodes. You can connect with us on our socials. You can get access to our podcast through all the podcast feeds. You can get access to our YouTube channel, which we post on there as well. Basically, we're everywhere you want us to be.
Yes, and many places you would probably don't. But
that's
we're everywhere. Send us a message. If you check out a YouTube video, you like it, leave us a comment. We try to respond to everything that comes through. Look at some of our past episodes. If you enjoyed this about video games, we have a Nintendo retrospective, a TurboGrafx-16 retrospective, one of our first episodes, maybe I think our third episode?
Third, I believe so.
Yeah, and then one of the most fun episodes we've had, which was our Wii episode. So we've done a lot of stuff, and including an episode about arcades and arcade memories. So lots of cool stuff about video games and other things. So check out our episodes. You'll find something you like, I hope. And if not, try again. If not, keep looking. Keep looking.
Listen to all of them before you form an opinion.
Listen, and seriously, once you're done with that, listen twice. Because, you might pick up on something you missed.
We do grow on you. That's for sure.
Yeah, I hope.
Yeah. All right. Have a good day, Dave.
Thanks, guys.